The magic of the battling Aian and Ganthu crackled and snapped and lit up the entire forest around them, and all the animals fled in panic. Runes appeared on the surface of the barrier, both blue and red, and they too battled with each other, magic against magic and spell against spell. Some escaped the barrier and rose into the air as though they were being carried by a mighty whirlwind, much like the embers from a fire were scattered by the wind. And the trees and plants they came into contact with were either set alight or scorched. The floating runes and heat created by the opposing magics made it harder for the Bagadons to hammer at the barrier, so they withdrew to wait for the Aian to weaken. They had great faith in their leader to battle a guardian and defeat him, for he had done it twice before the Great Wars after the Guardians had the audacity to challenge one of the most ancient of their kind. The Aian grimaced as another wave of the Ganthu's formidable magic struck his barrier, and he was pushed back another few inches towards the river. He recalled his brother battling the tribal leader many aeons ago in a valley on the other side of the world during the last Great War, and how he'd made a tactical error by allowing the Bagadons to force him into a narrow gully where their huge numbers had overwhelmed him. Once fallen and trapped beneath them, the Ganthu had then come in and killed him with a mighty downward thrust of his blazing staff right through his heart. The shockwave had not only killed some of the Bagadons, but had split the earth, and the dead Aian and Bagadons had fallen through, never to be seen again. The Ganthu, almost drained of magic and badly wounded from the effects of the shockwave, had used what was left of his magic to fly himself out of the gully just before the earth had opened up. And he had been found half dead on the scorched earth by the Kawatha and their allies, and imprisoned inside a sphere of magic by the Shashas. That was how he had been beaten the last time, and how the war had ended. And the Bagadons had been banished deep inside the oldest forests and warned not to challenge the other ancient ones again, or they would regret it. Despite losing his life, the Guardian had won the day and the war, and the Aian took courage from that memory and reminded himself why and for whom he was fighting today. There simply could not be another great war because their kind wouldn't survive the attention it would draw from the humans. Another powerful surge of red energy pounded the barrier, and the Aian grunted and strained but held his ground. He looked over his shoulder and saw Shelley, Ben and Alwanai approaching the portal, surrounded by the Vympari, and smiled. He just had to hold on for a little longer until they were through and the portal had shut, for then the Ganthu could not follow them to the secret ritual site. The Ganthu put his face right up against the barrier and snarled at the Aian. He was surprised at the Guardian's strength, for he had not held this form for centuries. But no matter, he could not stand against the Ganthu's ancient power for much longer. Surprising the Kawatha by starting the change early had been an act of genius, because they had not been prepared for the onslaught of his people in Hallow Grove. The mere start of their invasion into the human world with the sole purpose of wiping out their entire race. He had learned many lessons during the Great Wars, and one of them, the most important in his opinion, was that if one followed the rules blindly, then failure was almost guaranteed. The Bagadons had never tolerated weakness from any of the other races and had always held those inferior to them in contempt. They were one of only 2 tribes that had emerged first at the dawn of time, the mighty Genastri being the second. The towering Genastri had skin like granite and eyes that glowed like embers, and they lived deep underground in massive caves and tunnels to remain close to their beloved volcanoes. There were almost 1 million of their kind scattered across the earth at the time, because the planet was still being formed and the Genastri were the primary caretakers who controlled the shift of the tectonic plates and so helped form the surface of the new world. When it came to numbers, the Bagadons, who had been created by Untuis from the rich life-giving soil of the land, weren't far behind. Over the eons that followed, Untuis created the elemental Kawatha first, and then more and more ancient ones, like the Avari, by joining her creation magic with Grandfather Sun and Goddess Moon. Those like the Kawatha and Avari tended more towards the spiritual aspects of their existence by communing with the creators in the sky and working with them to populate the earth with animals and creatures of all kinds, and enriching the water, the soil and air so that even more life could come forth on its own. But it was their unwillingness to acknowledge the Bagadons and Genastri as their superiors, because they were the firstborn and therefore deserved greater respect and deference, that led to many of the first clashes between the tribes. Instead of working together as equals with the other tribal leaders, the leaders of the Genastri and Bagadons had colluded to establish permanent control over the earth, simply because they did not like the way the Kawatha and some of the younger tribes were creating life without considering the consequences. And they had been proven right when early humans had suddenly emerged. To this day, it was a great mystery who had formed them and given them life. And their numbers had grown surprisingly fast across the northern territories, much like a virus. As soon as that started happening, the Ganthu had expressed his outrage, and he and the leader of the Genastri had threatened to wipe out the human plague if the Kawatha and their allies didn't stop. From this first act of aggression, the First Great War had taken place, and it was during that war that most of the Genastri had been killed and the rest trapped underground forever, when the Kawatha had awakened the earth again with their elemental earth magic, causing catastrophic shifts of the massive tectonic plates that had split the singular landmass apart to create continents. The earth had shaken for decades, and great floods had also helped reshape the surface, and during the upheavals, the Kawatha and their allies had saved the humans from extinction by leading them to high ground and relocating them to the various continents, and then encouraging them to expand. This, more than anything, had stirred up the Bagadons' hatred for humans and their own kind. And to this day, the Ganthu work to undo the uncontrolled spread of the human virus that was systematically destroying the earth through their greed and disrespect for nature. The Ganthu screamed a command, and his tribesmen ran at the barrier and slammed into it. The Aian cried out at the brutal onslaught against his mind and body, but still his magic held, for his will was as formidable as the Ganthu, if not greater because of what was at stake for humankind and every ancient one on the planet. Alwanai had to succeed today, or every living being on Earth was doomed.
You cannot win, Aian.
The Ganthu rasped inches from the strained face of the glowing figure.
My power is too great. I have been preparing for this day since the last Great War, while you have been playing at living as a weak, pathetic human. Do you have no pride in what you are?
The Aian averted his eyes, for the twisted smile on the Ganthu's dark grey, bark-like face was awful to behold, and his obsidian eyes glinted with evil and menace.
You know I cannot let you pass,
he said, and added a surge of magic from his staff to prove it. The Ganthu screamed when golden energy ran up his arms and almost reached his head before he stopped it.
I will not hesitate to kill you, Ganthu, but I would prefer not to.
The Ganthu growled and hissed and shook off his enemy's burning magic with some effort.
If you do not kill me,
he rasped,
then you will die.
The Aian was surprised not to feel any fear in his words, even though the possibility of his dying was high, and instead a deep calm settled over him, making him smile.
Alwanai will give you what you want,
he said, and watched the Ganthu's black eyes widen.
What do you mean?
Alwanai was a mystery to the Ganthu because he did not yet know how she fitted into what the Kawatha were doing. She was part of why he'd ordered the great change to take place earlier, because he wanted to be in control of what happened today.
Will she destroy the humans, Aian? Because I seriously doubt that. The Kawatha would never allow it.
He moved closer to the Ganthu, making sure the magic didn't touch his skin.
You have so much hatred and bitterness inside you, and you cannot see what the Kawatha and your fellow ancient ones are doing.
The Ganthu's face scrunched up alarmingly in the semblance of a frown.
And what is that?
He asked.
They are saving every magical being and in effect the entire world.
You lie!
He spat.
They will never kill their little human pets.
Ah, but they will,
the Aian said.
Just not in the way you think.
He looked over his shoulder again in time to see the large group floating through the portal. The Ganthu must have seen it too, because he screamed in fury. And this time the blast of magic didn't only come from his staff, but from his entire being. The Aian was lifted off his feet and flung backwards through the air, and he heard the Bagadon shriek and howl in victory. Fortunately, the stunned, gasping Aian stayed conscious and kept up the barrier with what was left of his flagging will. Seeing the Aian on the ground and in obvious pain, the Ganthu shouted at his people to bring down the barrier, and then he added his magic to their efforts. The golden wall stuttered, and soon ragged holes began to appear, and the first of many Bagadons started climbing through. The Aian stood to his feet with his staff held before him, and as soon as the portal closed with a wink and a loud crack, he dropped the barrier, and the Ganthu came for him. Both staffs whirled and sang when the two mighty beings began to fight each other, and the Bagadons surrounded them on the river's embankment and watched with eager, hungry eyes for the moment the Aian fell and they could rip him to pieces. But they were so caught up in the fierce battle that they did not see or hear over 1,000 figures of all shapes and sizes coming towards them through the forest, nor that they glowed green, blue, red and yellow, and that the earth had begun to tremble beneath their feet.